I knew, like with the Colts, I knew not to get on a bus and go to another location. I knew not to eat any of the food or drink any of the water. I knew what a lot of the tricks were. And so in some ways, by taking it more seriously, it's almost like you let your curiosity just completely overwhelm you and take you over in the research process. Then you know enough that you're armed with some knowledge. Again, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing because I'm sure, you know, things could still end badly. But likewise with outlaw biker gangs, by the time I did any of that, I knew how to read, you know, gang patches. I knew how to read vests. And you know who's trouble, who's not. You know who you just don't talk to. You turn the other way, you leave the place. And so you start understanding a little bit the dialect of these subcultures.
Were you ever able to say to one of them, I'm writing a book?
Yeah, well,
that often can get you a lot of information. I wondered if bikers respond well to that, for example.
What helped me a lot with that one is I know one guy, one of the very few guys who wrote undercover with outlaw biker gangs for 7 years and lived. I mean,
undercover how? You mean for law enforcement?
Agency, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And he's one of the few guys who did. And I flew out to meet him in Miami. It was really fun. I was with some of my college roommates who were pretty preppy. It was sort of timed with a bachelor party. So there's all my friends, you know, in the lobby. Everyone's checking out to go home, and I'm meeting this guy, and everyone had, you know, the sweaters and the luggage and the whole thing. This guy came to meet me, like, you know, the balding pate and the ponytail down the back, and just, I mean, he had the whole look, the long beard, and it was really funny. And so I kind of thought, those are the two sides of my life, and that's one of the reasons why I happen to find my life so enjoyable. You know, it's sort of the privilege that I get to basically interact with anybody who I find interesting. You know, if I choose to write a book in that direction, I get to talk to people from all different backgrounds, all different demographics, all different education levels, and you find out how incredibly smart people are who are experts in anything, you know, that you might not expect. And so he gave me an enormous, just a wealth of knowledge. And I was able to talk to him because he was a biker for 7 years. And so I really got in there well.
You're truly leading a life where nothing is wasted, aren't you?
I hope so.
But I mean, I think that's one of the great things about being a writer is that, you know, basically it's all, of course, some writers have been described in some books as, you know, kind of cannibals that turn on their friends and family and all.
Right.
And,
the Truman Capote model.
Yeah, digest them all out and spit them out into books and all. But there is a sort of wonderful way that any experience can, in fact, feed into a narrative.
Well, it's great. I mean, you pick up slang from anybody. I mean, you go to a baseball game, and a lot of times I'll be listening. If I've been on book tour the last while, and I'm try to go to baseball games wherever I can because I'm a baseball guy, and just anywhere that I'm sitting, just listening to what are the different accents? What's the slang of the region? What are great turns of phrase that and you just archive it all. And what's really great is it opens you up to everything. I mean, there's no inherent categories that you don't have interest in, because if you're writing well, it's anything, it's top to bottom. And so it's just as interesting to talk to somebody who has what most people might think is the most boring job in the world, but you start talking to them, and everybody in every job has a high level of expertise for what they do, and they have their own perspective and their own slant on it. And it's like having talked to enough people from enough jobs, it's something that's really interesting.
So even a little cameo character can become extraordinarily more vivid in a book if you're able to put in one or two authentic things or language or something that you've archived, even if it's a guy checking you in at a hotel or something.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's, in the more obvious examples, again, we've been talking about Do No Harm and the crime writer a lot, but Do No Harm, he perceives the world as a physician. And that's the part of it that I think I know from my dad. Like if somebody has a particular gait, my dad will say, oh, based on his age and this, I wonder if it was polio before the vaccine. That's how he sees the world. Like, they say...
a diagnostician.
Yeah.
A walking diagnostician.
Exactly. And, if somebody has a slight tremor, my dad will, he'll figure... that's the way that he sees things. The same way that if I'm out with someone who is a spy, I have a friend who's a former spy, and every time we're out, he's looking at how clean homeless people's shoes are to see if it's someone on a stakeout.
So there's a whole causation thing going on with people like that, which actually is terrific for a writer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the same way that when you or I read a book, a piece of crime fiction, being more familiar with it. And I'm not someone for whom reading is ruined, as I've said, or going to movies is ruined because I only see the architecture. For me, it only heightens it. So for me, when I read Motherless Brooklyn, when I read Dennis Lehane, it's just that much better because I'm seeing how they're doing everything right. Like for me, it's just seeing something that is a particular nuance or a particular approach only adds to the pleasure for me. But it's sort of like the way that you know, we would perceive reading books is, you know, that's the same thing. You're talking about anybody, no matter what. If someone's a cleaning lady, they see things based on what surfaces can be cleaned or not. So then you get into a crime scene where you know, you're trying to lift blood spatter off a countertop. It's interesting to know what other things went into the mix, you know. So those are those places where you try and find that authenticity to round out even your
walk-on characters,
tertiary characters.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I agree, and I think you're very good at it. And tell me this: the crime writer, the basic premise is one of the great cliches of crime fiction, and I thought that was interesting that you would pick that particular archetype to work with. And in writing our newsletter for August, I counted up, and I think there were either 6 or 8 novels, all with the same premise, which is somebody wakes up, you know, with no memory of how he or she got to where, and you know, and then something has clearly happened.
Right.
And what could that be? And I found that fascinating because each book is its own book. I mean, it's not that anybody has cloned anybody else's book, but I do think it's one of those predicaments maybe that is, anybody can be horrified at the prospect that one day they'll wake up and their memory
is gone.
Yeah. And yet they are specifically supposed to have done something, and they can't even verify it because they're the one thing that you think would be truth, their own memory, has been erased by whatever the trauma is.
They're their own unreliable narrator.
Exactly. It is a wonderful variation on that extremely tricky, unreliable narrator. You want to elaborate what that means? Because it's such a great thing.
I mean, you know, in The Crime Writer, it opens with, you know, Drew Danner wakes up in a hospital room. He's got a scar on his head. He's got his ex-fiance's blood under his fingernails and cannot remember anything. And obviously everybody thinks that he did it. He begins to question if he did it himself. And what's nice is you can go with a character and trust them, but the character himself isn't unreliable, and that you don't have to create a character who's messing with you as the reader. The character can be reporting everything as it really happens, but he, by nature of having amnesia, becomes unreliable, meaning that he is pursuing the story of what happened. Drew's a writer. He's trying to get and reconstruct the story of what happened that night. And we can go with him and feel a rapport and a trust with him as our narrator, but by nature of his having amnesia, we can't trust him all the way because he can't trust himself all the way.
Exactly, which is a lot different than a character who is lying to the reader.
Right.
And there I think you have such a trust violation, it's very difficult for a reader to bond with a character who is actually lying to them in the narrative.
Right. Or it's a wonderful, you know, like Lolita has a wonderfully unreliable narrator, but it's doing a whole different thing.
Right.
And so with crime fiction, when you have an unreliable narrator, sometimes it can get tiresome if you don't have the trust with the narrator, because you're saying, well, you know, if you're the first person, you're the author, the first person, the protagonist. Like, you could just reveal this right now, but you're not, just for the sake of trickery. It can get wearing, or it can start to feel contrived. I think one of the reasons why I chose it, you're talking about that being sort of a classic crime fiction story. I mean, it seems like something out of, you know, Hitchcock. Like, it's one of those classic notions. You wake up, you have no memory. Obviously, Ludlum, The Bourne Identity, still going strong. And one of the reasons why I picked that up and sort of polished it off and made it my own to play with it is because of the fact that, you know, Drew is a writer of potboilers. And so, you know, a lot of the Crime Writer is also a book that's very much about crime writing.
Right.
And so here he's dealing with the story that we're familiar with, but he's also familiar with it, and that he's worked on things that are similar. So now he's working on it in his real life and trying to deal with the contrast between the classic story, as he knows it or might have envisioned it, and real life. And the two of those, when they collide, it's a much nastier situation than he would have thought.
Well, there's a wealth of irony in your book. I mean, basically, Drew becomes a character in his own narrative.
Right. He becomes his own protagonist, and he finally figures out about, you know, and he has all the resources. He has all the resources to further what's essentially like a bungled, fictitious investigation. And so he has to figure out what things, you know, he's constantly running into people who say, I'm sure you can get a DNA analysis run in 24 hours in one of your books, Drew. This is the real world. It doesn't work that way out here. But he has this cast of characters. He's got consultants who are cops. He knows criminalists who he's dealt with before. He's got best friends with connections to the underworld. He has the same kinds of friends and personalities around him that I do.
Yeah, he's got his own forensic specialist. He's got, you know, all kinds of things going for him.
But now it's live.